Next, we're going to bring a new job up, and that's because we want it to run separately from the dimension job. And what we're going to do is we're going to create the fact table. Now you may remember, we look at our star schema, that the fact table is made up of a primary key who's a combination of foreign keys from each of the dimensions that are involved in the star schema, and any measure that you may need in your fact table. So before we start, I want to show you overall what we're doing. First we're going to read the measures, and they're going to come from Zage Small. And those are the things that are going to help us calculate revenue. We already kind of went through the logic of this when we did the star schema in the previous module. But then we need to look up, we're going to grab the original keys from Zage Small, and we're going to do reverse lookups to go find the key for each one of the dimensions. Because remember, we changed the values of the keys because we want synthetic keys. We don't want keys that can be traced back to the original tables. The reason is that when we're combining data from several sources, we're not sure that the keys are going to match A. So in this particular example, they do. But in other examples, you could be pulling data from your sales database and one from your finance database, and the ID for customer, let's say, may not match, right? So we don't want to use a production key. So we're going to go back and figure out the synthetic key from our dimensions that we already built, and that's why we have to run all the dimension jobs ahead of time. And then we have the measures, and finally we write out our fact table. And then our fact table, we're going to have to assign both the primary key and a foreign key. So our star schema has dimensions and facts. The dimension only has primary keys, no foreign keys. And the fact table is made up of a primary key that is made up of foreign keys from the dimension. So this is the process that we're going to go through this to create our fact table. So let's go ahead and start a clean Alteryx job. So we'll do a new workflow, and I'm going to save it as our fact. And I've provided you the solution. But okay, so first we have to go read the measures from Little Zage, because that's where the numbers are, that's where the transactions are. Again, we have worked through the logic of this in the previous module when we created our star schema. So what do we need? We need the measures, and then we need the lookup keys. So let me drop an input data. We should have MySQL still there. And we're going to go to Zage Small. And the sales information is inside sales transaction and also sold via, right? We want number of items. We also want product price. Let's drop sold via and say that we want number of items. Let's bring up product. From product, we want product ID, and product price is going to be part of our measure. Let's bring up sales transaction. Sales transaction is going to give us the customer ID and the store ID and the transaction date. So actually we didn't need to involve all the tables. We got all the IDs we needed: customer ID, store ID, the transaction date, the product ID, and then we wanted, as far as measures, the number of items and the product price. Say OK. And notice we have all the IDs that we need: product ID, customer ID, store ID, transaction date. They're not IDs yet, but we're going to go look up the IDs from our dimensions, and then we've got number of items and product price. And if we want, we can take these two fields and create a calculated field, which is product price times number of items, which gives us the total sales. That is completely up to us to do. So let's start our reverse lookups. It's a good idea to label these. So I'm going to come over here, and rather than this long query, I'm going to say query Zage Small for fact table measures and lookup IDs. Okay, let's start with customer. Let's go get the customer key. So now here we're going to connect for the first time. We haven't done this yet. We've outputted to the data warehouse. This is the first time we read from the data warehouse. We're going to connect to the customer table. So the Zagi data warehouse, dim customer, and from dim customer we want two things. We want the customer key, because that's what we want to replace in our data stream, and the customer ID. And now we're going to do a join. And over here I'm going to comment, look up customer key. Understand what we're doing, right? We're going back and finding the new synthetic key that we assigned, because at the end we want a fact table that has the key from the dimension. So if I look at my join, I have to go to settings, and I want to say let's match customer ID to customer ID. Okay, and I actually didn't spell them the same. One I put a dash and one I didn't. I really should be careful to do that, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to get rid of them. So left and right, you remember what that means. Left means data coming from the left-hand side. Right means data come from the right-hand side. I want to keep product ID. I want to keep number of items. I want to keep product price. I'm going to get rid of customer ID, and I'm going to get rid of customer ID from the other side. Okay, let me run that real quick. What does that look like? Okay, I'm starting to get my primary key built, okay? Now that says customer ID, so I made a mistake somewhere. I want customer key to come back out, or I'm not. Oh, there I am. Let's go here. There we go. So I'm tagging the customer key at the end of this data stream. So I'm starting to build my primary key. Notice that now customer ID is gone from here. I've replaced it with customer key. Let's look up store next. So we back over here, and we're back, and we're going to read from the store dimension. So back to Zagi Data Warehouse. Here's my store dimension. Double click here. I want both the store key and the store ID. The rest of the information I don't need. That is in the dimension. They're going to be part of my star schema. We'll join them soon enough with primary key, foreign key relationships. And now I've got to do a join. So I'm doing a series of joins. I want that center join. So I'm going to say, okay, I went and read from the store key. Store ID is equal to store ID. I'm going to get rid of store ID from here. I don't need it anymore from either side. But I do want to keep store key. If I go ahead and run that. I'll highlight here. I've now added not just customer key, but store key. So I'm slowly building my fact table and replacing those production IDs with the actual dimension keys. Okay, let's go get product. I'm not being as careful at documenting here because the solution I provide you has all the documentation. I'm just being careful about the length of this video. So back to Zagi Data Warehouse. Product, I want product key and product ID. Now you see why I left that ID in the dimension, though it's not really necessary. In the dimension itself, it is helping me look up the key from the dimension. Let's do a join again. It grabbed the right join, and I don't want that. So I'm going to delete the connection. If I right click on that, I'm allowed to do that. Connect these two things. So it's product ID to product ID. I don't want product ID. Product ID on this either, but I do want my product key. So go ahead and run that. So now I've pegged on product key, so I'm almost there. I now need to go look up the key for this transaction date. I want to replace transaction date with the key from the calendar dimension. So let's go ahead and get our date dimension. So let's bring an input. And we are going to go MySQL. Here's Zoggy Data Warehouse. Here's calendar. We want calendar key and full date. Okay, we're going to join on that full date. We have to say transaction date from one side, full date from the other. Let's run before we write out to see if we have any issues. We got an error. Often you're going to have to troubleshoot with dates. It's unfortunate, but it's just how it reads them from MySQL. So let's take a look at what this looks like. It looks like when it's reading, even though we didn't write it that way, it looks like when it's reading from the calendar dimension, it's reading full date as date time. So we can, and coming out of our query, transaction date is not date time. So we can fix that quickly. You're always just going to have to kind of check and troubleshoot, but we'll go with a select statement. And what we'll say is, let's make full date just date. Let's see what happens. So problem solved. What is coming out? We have a leftover transaction date. Let's go take that out. Here from the left-hand side, we do want calendar key. We don't want full date. We just want number of items, product price, customer key, store key, product key, and calendar key. So let's see. Did we fix it? Now it looks like a fact table. So let's go ahead and write it out as a fact table. And we'll call this fact, not sales. And we have to tell it use, and so let's paste our code as our pre. We're essentially saying the same things we did with our dimensions. Use Zoggy Data Warehouse so it knows what schema to use. And exist the table if it already exists. In fact, we can rerun, and it should still work. We're set. We go over to SQL, and we did a refresh. We can see we now have a fact table. Now what our fact table doesn't have is any kind of primary key or any kind of foreign key. And we're going to have to create that. We will do that in the next video.